The old Ford rattled, suspension screaming, sirens wailed behind, each note a hammer blow to his nerves. Dust billowed, obscuring the road ahead. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Then the diner appeared, a beacon at the end of the world. Or maybe the end of the road, because right beyond it, the earth simply vanished. A sheer drop, lost in the swirling mist below. He slammed the brakes, tires protesting. The diner door opened, a figure silhouetted against the warm light within. No time. He threw the car into park and ran, the ground falling away behind him. He didn't look back. He could hear shouts, the screech of tires, but his focus narrowed to the maze of alleys opening before him like escape routes in a nightmare. The city awaited. He didn't know this city, yet it felt strangely familiar. Buildings rose, a jumble of brick and steel and glass draped in neon and shadow. The air thrummed with a hidden energy, a discordant symphony of city sounds. Footsteps echoed behind him. He had to vanish, become part of the urban tapestry. He ducked into an alley, the stench of refuse assaulting his nostrils. A rat scurried past, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. The sound of pursuit faded, replaced by the city's muffled roar. He was lost, alone and utterly adrift. The alley twisted and turned, a labyrinth of brick and shadow. Graffiti-covered walls closed in, a riot of color and cryptic messages. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of exotic spices and something else, something wild and untamed. He could hear the flutter of wings, the rustle of feathers. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was prey here, hunted. He emerged onto a narrow street, the buildings leaning precariously towards each other as if trying to touch. The sky above was a sliver of bruised purple. A single street lamp cast an anemic glow, illuminating the cobblestones beneath his feet. He had to get his bearings, find a way out of this concrete jungle. As he walked, he noticed something peculiar. The buildings were adorned with intricate carvings, strange symbols and faces that seemed to watch him with silent disapproval. Gargoyles perched on rooftops, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The city was alive, watching his every move. He turned a corner and found himself facing a small park, an oasis of green amidst the concrete. But even here, the strangeness persisted. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and perched on a bench, as if waiting for him, was an old woman. She sat very still, a shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes like chips of blue ice. She watched him approach with an unnerving intensity. He hesitated, unsure whether to speak or slip away unnoticed. "Lost, are you?" she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "This city," she continued, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond him, "it plays tricks on the mind. Beware the birds, young man, they're not what they seem." He frowned, confused. Birds? What did birds have to do with anything? Before he could ask, she rose to her feet, her eyes boring into his. "They'll steal your memories," she whispered, her breath hot on his cheek. "They'll steal your very soul." And with that, she turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows like a phantom. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, unsure what to make of the encounter. He'd stumbled into a nightmare, he was sure of it. But nightmares weren't supposed to be real, were they? He left the park, his senses on high alert. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, fueling his paranoia. He scanned the rooftops, half expecting to see a murder of crows, their eyes burning with malevolent intent, but there were no crows. Instead, he saw something far stranger. Perched atop a lamppost, its plumage a riot of emerald and sapphire, was a bird unlike any he'd seen before. Its eyes like polished obsidian beads followed his every move, and it wasn't alone. On rooftops and window ledges he began to notice them, birds of every shape and size, their feathers a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. They watched him with an unsettling intensity, their silence more unnerving than any screech or caw. He hurried on, each rustle of wings sending a shiver down his spine. The city was a giant aviary, and he was trapped within its cage. He turned a corner and collided with something solid. He stumbled back, heart racing, expecting to see another pursuer, but it was only a small, intricately crafted model train, its engine hissing steam. He looked up and realized he was standing before a miniature railway, its tracks winding through a meticulously crafted cityscape. Section 5. City of Iron and Steam. The miniature city was a marvel of detail, tiny buildings, bustling streets, and even a miniature park with a working fountain. Miniature people went about their day, oblivious to his presence. He watched, mesmerized, as a tiny train chugged past, its whistle a shrill shriek in the stillness. He crouched down, examining the craftsmanship. Each building was a work of art, crafted with meticulous care. He noticed something odd. One of the buildings was a miniature replica of the diner on the cliff. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a jolt shot through him. The world around him dissolved into a swirling vortex of color and sound. He closed his eyes, his stomach churning. When he opened them again, he was no longer staring at a miniature city. He was staring at a phone booth, its glass cracked, its paint peeling. A young woman stood inside, her face pale, her hand clutching the receiver. She glanced up, her eyes widening in alarm. "Help me," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. "He's coming!" He He stared at her, his mind reeling. He was no longer surrounded by fantastical birds or miniature cities. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and damp pavement. The oppressive presence of the surreal city had lifted, replaced by a different kind of tension. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The woman's eyes darted nervously towards the street. He's dangerous. Please, I need to get out of here." He hesitated, torn between caution and a strange compulsion to help her. She seemed genuinely terrified. He couldn't just leave her there. "Okay," he said, stepping closer to the booth. "Let's get you out of here. Where do you need to go?" The woman's shoulders slumped slightly in relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just anywhere but here, please." He reached out to open the booth door, but before his fingers could touch the handle, a sound cut through the air, a siren. And this time, it was getting closer. The siren sliced through his thoughts, sharp and insistent. He froze, his hand hovering inches from the phone booth door. The woman inside whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. He could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. He glanced back at the approaching wail. It was too familiar, too close. It was the same sound that had chased him to the edge of the world, or at least to the edge of that cliffside diner. But this time, there was nowhere left to run. The city, once his labyrinthine escape route, now felt like a cage. "He's here!" the woman choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He's found me!" He turned back to her, confusion warring with a growing sense of dread. Who was this he, and what did he have to do with any of this? The question swirled in his mind, unanswered and increasingly irrelevant. He had a choice to make, right here, right now. He could run. He could leave this woman to her fate and disappear back into the maze of the city. Or he could stay. He could face whatever was coming, even if it meant facing his own demons in the process. He didn't have time to decide. The decision was made for him. The wail of the siren spiked, resolving itself into the screech of brakes and the echoing thud of a car door slamming shut. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching the phone booth. He glanced around, but the street was deserted. The buildings seemed to lean closer, the shadows deepening as if the city itself were holding its breath. He was trapped, caught in the open with nowhere to hide. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, but there was nothing there. No weapon, no phone, no identification. Nothing but the cold, hard knot of fear in his gut. The footsteps stopped, just outside the phone booth. He could feel the presence of the newcomer, a wall of solid menace even before he turned to face his pursuer. The air crackled with unspoken threat, and for the first time he understood the true meaning of fear. This was no ordinary cop. This was something else entirely. "Well, well," a voice boomed, thick with amusement and something colder, something that sent shivers down his spine. "Look what we have here. A reunion. How touching." He turned slowly, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him. The world tilted, the edges blurring as if reality itself were coming unstitched. Standing before him, bathed in the harsh glare of the police car's headlights, was himself. Or rather, a distorted reflection of himself. Older, harder, his face etched with the weariness of 1,000 sleepless nights. His eyes, though, those were the most unsettling part. Cold, calculating, and filled with a chilling familiarity. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice a dry croak in the stillness. The figure chuckled, a humorless sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Don't you recognize me? I'm you. Or at least, I'm what you're becoming." He shook his head, trying to make sense of the impossible. None of this made sense. The city, the birds, this doppelganger. It was all too much. He felt a hand on his shoulder, firm but reassuring. He turned to see the woman from the phone booth, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pity and understanding. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice calming amidst the chaos. "You're safe now. It was all just a dream." A dream? He looked from the woman to his doppelganger, then back again. Was she right? Had it all been some bizarre, fevered dream, the city, the chase, the impossible creatures, all figments of his imagination? He closed his eyes, willing himself to wake up, and slowly, the world around him began to fade. The sounds of the city, the oppressive presence of his other self, the gentle touch of the woman's hand, all of it slipped away until there was nothing left but darkness, and the faint, lingering echo of a question he couldn't quite place. Who was the dreamer, and who was the dream?